So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this second edition of the Michigan State University Food Security Group's Tough Questions series. Um, we launched this a month ago as trying to provide a platform. What we hope is that this will provide a platform for discussion, ideally no holds barred discussions about tough questions in what we do and how we go about doing our work. Questions which, maybe we don't talk about as much as we could, and that if we could have some good in-depth discussion about them, we think we might be able to learn how to do our work a little bit better. The first session last year was on ethical dilemmas in the work that we do. It was moderated by Laura Schmidt-Olabisi of MSU's Community Sustainability Department. We're going to have one or two more sessions during March and April after this one. And this current session is focused on the research to policy pipeline, okay? And after using that term, I'm going to say that it's actually quite an inadequate, I'm going to do a self-critique here, and an inadequate visual for what we're looking at, right? I think, a squiggly curved line that doubles back on itself and hopefully moves forward towards some kinds of policy influence is really, what we're talking about here. And hopefully that's going to come through as we have this discussion. So, in my kind of introductory comments here, then just a few observations. One, I think everybody on this panel, and probably many of you that are listening, we pride ourselves on being applied researchers, right? I think we likely, many of us, if not a large majority of us, pride ourselves on doing policy relevant work. Although some of you on this call, hopefully, are not researchers. Hopefully, we don't have only researchers on this call, and you are, an audience for, and you're interested in some of this, what we call anyway, policy relevant work. But I would ask, how often do we really look at how our work influences policy? I know that some of you do, some of us do, but how systematic are we about that? How consistent are we about that, right? And how often do we think about how policy is actually made? What I think of as the inevitably messy social and political process of policymaking, right? As much as we like to think that our research, is taken up and put into policy design, sometimes it is, but many times in very kind of indirect ways, right? And we run, especially when we're talking about Western or Western-based researchers, working in developing countries, and it all being tied up in the whole donor setting, right? There's a real risk of what Pritchett and Andrews refer to as isomorphic mimicry. So maybe my irreverent definition of that being a country saying, sure, you want a policy or a program that checks these 8 boxes, we'll give you a policy or program that checks these 8 boxes, right? And that, I would say for that very reason, is not implemented, is not actually implemented. Thus, this concept of isomorphic mimicry, the mimicking of what are supposedly best practice policies and programs, okay? And then finally, how often do we consider the implications of how policy is actually made for what we work on and how we work on it? So hopefully what I mean by this how I can make clear as we get into some of the discussion. So without going on further, let me introduce the panelists. Dr. Bhavani Shankar is professorial research fellow in food systems, nutrition, and sustainability at the University of Sheffield's Institute for Sustainable Food and the Department of Geography. His research explores the intersections of food, health, and environmental sustainability. I think I'll probably leave it at that. He did chair the high level panel of experts report on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition. So Bhavani is just very well placed in the applied research, policy research universe to be speaking with us today. Dr. Danielle Resnick is a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Unit at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, Global Economy and Development Program. Um, and her work focuses on the political economy of agricultural policy and food systems. I'll also leave it at that in the interest of time. Finally, Aidan Colville is a senior economist in the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation, or DIME, department, and his work focuses on designing rigorous impact evaluations to inform policies that expand access to essential services such as water, sanitation, electricity, and broadband. And what interests us here about Aidan's work is some of the work he's done about how policymakers, policy practitioners, researchers update their beliefs based on research and other kind of related research that Aidan has done. Okay, so I've actually gone a little bit over my time. I'm not now going to turn to our panelists. We'll start with Bhavani with 7 to 8 minutes of comments, and then we'll move on. Bhavani, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
I
I'm
hear
really
you
pleased
just
to be
fine,
here.
yes.
Hi. Um, so, thank you, David, for that introduction, and thanks for mentioning the high-level panel of experts. I've basically just sort of divided my set of observations into two parts based upon recent experiences that I've had in this broad research to policy pipeline area. One is the HLP experience from a couple of years back, which is much more of a global sort of experience, global policy making, very high level. And the other is a complete contrast, which is based upon a project that I'm doing in India, which is trying to co-design policy with policymakers. It's very, very local. And so hopefully they offer some interesting contrasts. So kicking off with the high-level panel of experts. First, HLP. As many of you will know, there is the UN Committee for Food Security, UNCFS, which is the main United Nations body for food policy. It's basically where different countries come together, discuss food policy issues of the day, and organize under specific topics and programs of work. And then they try to jointly formulate a set of voluntary guidelines for the group of countries in the UN, which can then be mainstreamed into national policy making. So that's the broad idea of the UNCFS, and at least some of the work that they do. They do other things, of course, as well. So the high-level panel of experts, HLP, is the science policy interface, science policy platform for the UNCFS. HLP has got a regular committee of management committee, which operates on a long-term basis. What they do, the way the process works is that the UNCFS identifies a particular topic that they're interested in developing guidelines for, and they ask the HLP, the science policy interface, to basically go out and write a report or provide a report, facilitate a report that will draw together all the science in that area, bring it to them with a set of recommendations arising from the science for their consideration. And then there is a policy convergence process that happens after that, where for 1 year, the UNCFS debates those recommendations arising from the report, looks at the science, negotiates, and comes up with a set of guidelines based upon those recommendations, which they want to take forward. So that's how it works. So I had the privilege a couple of years back of leading the HLP report on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition, which basically involved working for about a year with a group of international experts from around the world who had been working in the inequalities in food systems area. And we sort of had weekly meetings, lots and lots of work that went into doing this report, which is basically like massive literature review, and which sort of looks at the science and comes up with a set of recommendations at the end of it. And it goes through a huge process of public consultation, international consultations, peer review by 8 different peer reviewers, and so on. So it's quite a rigorous process. At the end of it, it's presented to the UNCFS. Then the convergence process kicks off, where for a year the UNCFS debates this and looks at it. So, a couple of observations arising from this. First of all, is the good news is that there is a process within agricultural development, fairly broad level one, in the form of the HLP reports and the UNCFS deliberations, and it works. So that's good. In fact, the chances are that if you've been working in any of the areas that the HLP has been doing reports on, your work is already cited in the HLP reports. For example, in the inequalities report that we worked on, there are over 600 references to literature in the area. So very possibly your work is already being used in that pipeline to policy. So that's really good stuff. Another observation there from the process, and I was engaged in the post-report writing process as well as the leader of that panel in order to provide some expert inputs into deliberations during the policy convergence process. And this is a very intensive process that goes on for a whole year, as I said. And the reality is that the science is only the beginning, and even the recommendations that the scientists provide is only the beginning of a process that leads to the final set of guidelines. So the science that we provide and the recommendations that arise from it that we provide to them is discussed, negotiated, consensus is built around what is acceptable, what people like, and there's a whole process. That's why it takes a year into a final set of recommendations that has an intersection with what you started off with, but can, in some places, be quite different. So the science is only the beginning. The reality is that the policy can take off other different directions as well. The other observation I'd like to make about this whole process is that language and framing really, really, really matters. So it's not a matter of stating science in purely scientific terms, but the language and the framing is really important. So to give you an example, during, of course, writing an inequality report, one of the areas that we had to contend a lot with was intersectionality, which is a well-established concept in the social sciences and, of course, was extensively discussed during the report. But when it came to the policy convergence process and the meetings that I attended in order to help that group out, a lot of countries were really suspicious about the terminology intersectionality. In fact, one of them said, look, I'm really not comfortable with intersectionality. To me, it indicates something suggesting LGBTQ rights, which I don't even want to go into in the context of food systems. So can we use some of the terminology? So all these framings really, really matter. And so there is a whole process of decoding some of the scientific information and then making it palatable and applicable to a whole set of policymakers. And that is a challenge, and it needs a lot of work getting there. So language and framing really, really works. So there's a whole bunch of experiences from HLP. If you want to know more about it, then my colleague who worked with me on the panel, Jody Harris, has just written a blog on it, which is literally a couple of days ago. It's on the HLP website. It's also in the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Health website, and she's written about the process. It's really, really interesting. I would encourage you to read it. Now, let me turn to the very micro sort of local experience that I mentioned, which is a project that I lead called Indian Food Systems for Improved Nutrition Infusion, where we're working with the government of India, a state in India, where we're doing co-designing essentially market-focused interventions to improve delivery of nutritious foods to disadvantaged communities. Now, this is the policy environment we're working in is very, very challenging because it's rapidly moving, it's very complex, and it's a kind of research which is neither a situation where there is a well-established intervention that's running that the government has instituted that the scientists would like to come and study, and so you design your whole experiment or you study around it, nor is it something coming purely from the science side, which the policymakers have said, okay, we'll try that. It is something that is genuinely co-designed from the beginning, where we have a common broad areas of interest, and then we go from there and we negotiate the terms of the collaboration, go along and see where that leads us. And because there is a common interest in an overall objective and some broad direction of travel, and then designing the research on that basis. And it's been very, very interesting. And as I said, a very complex policy environment. One thing we've learned from it is that it takes a lot of time and a heck of a lot of work in order to get there. It's a very, very nonlinear process. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's always been stop and start. To give you one example from that, last year, India had elections, which meant that for 3 months, everything shut down. We couldn't meet communities. We couldn't do any policy-focused work. And then subsequently, of course, everybody gets transferred. The civil servants get transferred, and the people you're working with. And this happens about every 6 months or so. The people you're working with at the top of the tree all get transferred. New people come in, and then you have to start the process of talking to them all over again and reestablishing, explaining to them and convincing them that the work that you're doing collaboratively with them is worth it. And then so it's a very nonlinear process and takes real hard work. But I think the fruits of it are potentially worth it because the potential for impact is pretty large. So it requires incredibly hard work. It's something new to me, but I've been learning a lot from it. So basically, yeah, let me stop there. I think I'm out of time, but those are just a couple of observations that I wanted to share with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bhavani. A really great introduction here. I mean, your high level involvement in the HLPE, and then I'm fascinated. This is great. You're involved at this local level, co-designing the policies. You talked about the great deal of time that it takes to do that. You're absolutely right. So this gets us into issues of incentives for, researchers who are rewarded for rates and levels of publication and so forth. Let me just leave it at that to not take up more time. But great introduction. Thank you. Let's move on to Danielle.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave, and hello to everyone. So I've been working on the kind of research to policy space for, I guess, almost 20 years. When I first started at IFPRI, which is an applied policy research institute, as a research assistant almost 20 years ago. So a lot of my work either falls on either the design of tools and frameworks to better understand how we can track policy influence, or engaging in applied policy research, particularly on different types of governance and institutional reforms. So the kind of two examples I was going to share kind of were both focused on governance, institutional issues, but I learned quite different lessons from these experiences in terms of the research to policy pathway. So the first example, which is I think more my successful example, was actually focused on Nepal, which was a very new setting for me. A lot of my work is focused on sub-Saharan Africa. This was my first experience working in South Asia. And we were asked by the Nepalese government to how to help them with their reform process. Back at the end of the Maoist civil war in Nepal, one of the demands of the Maoist was for Nepal to transition from a unitary to a federal system, with power being given to 7 autonomous provinces. And this was passed in a constitutional reform in 2015. And this was then having ripple effects within the civil service about how do you reform, particularly your agricultural governance, in order to deal with this new set of powers being given to 7 provinces and to many, many subnational governments. And so even though this was quite a new setting for me, I was both new to Nepalese politics and policy issues, I did really recognize the bigger issues at stake, which was really how do you devolve functions in a way that enhance accountability and autonomy to subnational governments, but at the same time, you do not minimize coherence with national agricultural and development policies. And at the time, the Ministry of Agriculture was really focused on visiting India to better understand their federal structure. So obviously, it's a neighboring country, felt much more, aligned and familiar to policymakers. But I had actually said that they should be looking at Kenya instead. Kenya had begun its own devolution process only about 5 years prior to this, was facing many of the same issues, and had had some real failures that I thought maybe the Nepalese policymakers could learn from. This originally was dismissed out of hand. Reaction was, what can Asia learn from Africa? But I learned, actually, they did take my advice. They did a study tour there. And it really kind of reinforced to me that while it's important to have deep knowledge of a country, that's quite critical to have credibility, never underestimate the value of a comparative perspective to really help shed light on an issue. And we know that many policymakers really want concrete examples of how other countries have approached a particular policy problem, whether those solutions, are feasible in their own country country context. So that was kind of my kind of small success story. My kind of learning experience actually surprisingly came from a country I know very, very well, which is Zambia. I'd done part of my PhD in the country. I've worked on it for many, many years. And in this case, I was working on an international growth center project, looking at the challenges for local bureaucrats across the country's district council. The main issue has been that for many, many years, Zambia has been pushing towards greater decentralization for service provision. It's in almost every single national development strategy, but it really substantively hasn't progressed very far. And so we had a great team working with the University of Zambia, trying to look at some of the political economy bottlenecks to decentralization. We spent many weeks on the ground talking to bureaucrats across about more than 24 district councils, learned about issues with salary structures, resource constraints, issues between elected and appointed officials. And we had several really key policy recommendations to address these constraints. And yet I made quite a big mistake. I included something in our report to the Decentralization Secretariat, which was in office under the presidency. I made a point that would have been of great interest to political scientists who work on local governance, but really was not very welcome by policymakers in Zambia. And that was at that time, Zambia was under a different presidential administration at that time. And that government had been accused of favoring one particular ethnic group in cabinet appointments. And we noted in our report that we actually had found a similar trend in our survey of bureaucrats. There was a particular group that was really in the higher management positions in the district councils. And this really undermined our credibility with the Decentralization Secretariat, because they thought either I had a specific agenda, coming maybe supporting the opposition in the country, or that the findings would only add fuel to that discourse of ethnic favoritism. And so we really lost momentum on our engagement. We had some really clear policy findings on the decentralization issues, but we really lost our momentum. And it was something I really learned a lot about, regretted later on, because it's a country I know quite well and should have been a bit more savvy in knowing that that particular message would not have gone down well with the policy audience. And I think it really reinforces what Bhavani was just saying, that sometimes even if your research is incredibly well done, it's very rigorous and well informed, it's really the delivery and the messaging that can be almost even more fundamental to having impact. So I'll stop with those two lessons, Dave, and happy to talk more later on. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Danielle. Yes. For those of us that get out there and try to really work with local partners and have that policy influence, we're going to have hopefully some small successes, as you indicated, and also some failures, right? So that's what we've got to be learning from. Okay, let's turn to Aiden. And thank you, everybody, for keeping on time. And Aiden, actually, before, let me encourage people to please use the Q&A to put questions. You'll all be able to see the questions. I'll be addressing some of them verbally to the panelists when we're done with this portion. Aiden.
Great. Thanks, Dave, and thanks to Bhavani and Danielle for sharing some of your guys' thoughts as well. I've already learned a lot in this seminar myself, so hopefully others are doing the same. So just to introduce myself again, my name's Aiden Koval. I work in a group called the Development Impact Department at the World Bank. And so I want to start by just sort of saying, we think about evidence to policy pipeline as like this out there thing, but I wanted to start by just internalizing it a little bit, right? And sort of thinking about just asking yourself the question, how do we learn about stuff? How do you learn about stuff, right? And so when you start thinking about that question, you realize, yes, there's a lot of sort of like codified knowledge that we get. We're reading books, we're reading academic journals, we're going to formal trainings and things like that. But then there's also everything else, right? Which is all of the tacit knowledge that we're generating over time. And this is everything about us speaking to our colleagues in the corridors, learning about things just by doing them, experiencing them, and going through these sort of exercises on our own. Even if we know it, going through in a paper or in a book, going through that experience on your own is this kind of real learning experience for anything that we do in our own professional lives. And so I wanted to take that same framing and thinking to applying that both to how we've been thinking about the evidence to policy and learning from the evidence to policy pipeline ourselves, but then also how then the research on thinking about the evidence to policy pipeline within governments is something that we're sort of thinking about. So just as a start, Dime is an organization that's been around almost sort of 20 years within the bank. They kind of were a startup, and then we grew into this more of an institutionalized organization. And the idea here is that we sit at the intersection between the operations, which is what, the big part of what the World Bank is doing, giving large loans to all the different governments around the world, and the research side, which is, a large number of development economists and others thinking about, how you can apply, do interesting development economics research, but often these things are not connected, right? So we spend a lot of time using impact evaluation as a tool to really connect the dots here and try to bring evidence and operations together. And we do that within the institution, but then also try to do that with government agencies. And I think, just the sort of learning by doing experience that we've had over the last sort of 15 years or so of doing this is that we've tried to take things in a process where we've learned firstly that timing, secondly that things like group dynamics, and thirdly, that co-production are three kind of key areas that are really important in this process. This is not a paper that we've written that can tell us this, but this is just our own experience, this sort of tacit element, which is where we kind of frame this, where we bring lots of teams together. Instead of thinking about an individual team, a one-on-one basis, which is important in itself, we bring teams together that are thinking about the problem at the same time. They're thinking about how, for instance, am I going to design my water supply project, right? And this could be in Tanzania, it could be in Uganda, it could be in Nepal, wherever, right? And so having all of these teams come together and start thinking about what evidence exists already and how that can be brought in at the operational preparation phase, right? So not once the project is already up and running, but at that concept note phase when projects are being designed. And when you think about a project, I'm thinking about it from the World Bank side, where there's going to be a loan provided to the government for a particular program that the government is interested in. But then the government is working together with the World Bank to actually think about what the design of that is going to look like. So we really spend a lot of time bringing teams together and learning from each other at that early stage, so that decisions about the evidence can actually be brought into the project design stage at that point in time. If you come too late, it may be good evidence, but there's no actual point where you can actually have that decision that it gets brought into the project, right? So that's kind of just the tacit experience that we've had. But then we realized we also want to build codified knowledge, right? We want to actually generate evidence on what is working in the evidence to policy pipeline. This is some of the stuff Dave had mentioned earlier. And so we've been trying to build research thinking about actually doing analytical work, understanding how evidence is being used in these different settings and how adoption of evidence is coming along. And there's very initial work that's been done thinking about, understanding how individuals within government as policymakers have their initial priors or beliefs about certain things, and how evidence is then actually informing that, and what's that doing to sort of change their knowledge. Now, knowledge, of course, we know is one piece of the puzzle. There's all sorts of other pieces that are important. And then we say, okay, well, that's great if we can start to understand evidence as sort of informing things, but really to understand what's going on in these settings, which is kind of the next phase of the work we're trying to explore, is understanding how those pieces of information are coming into the broader picture of government bureaucracies. Now, there's often a lot of talk about government or sort of politics and country politics, and how politics are important in how we think about the use of evidence and the decision in big P policy, right? But the small p policy, in the sense of the actual operational nuts and bolts of projects, there's a huge number of different decisions that are being made, and those decisions are being made within an organizational bureaucracy. And a lot of the stuff that we do and think about often seems to, for whatever reason, abstract from the bureaucratic structures, right? And so what we're trying to do and think about together with many different partners, our colleagues, some of my colleagues, Eva Vivault and Daniel Rogger and others are sort of working in this space, really trying to understand what is the organizational structure of different governments, what are the different decisions that are being made in different nodes in this process, and where is evidence useful, but not just where is evidence useful, but where is the sort of context in which that's feeding into, linked to all of the tacit knowledge that people are building over time, right? And so an example, and then I'll stop for the open Q&A, is water quality is something that that we sort of we've always known is hugely important, but a lot of impact evaluations have shown very, very uncertain or unclear results when we think about water interventions, providing water supply, whatever it might be, very mixed evidence on the actual outcomes of health outcomes. But there's been a recent sort of meta-analysis on mortality specifically, and Michael Kramer's team in Chicago, gathering all this evidence up. I think it was about 20 or so different experimental studies showing that mortality can be reduced for under 5 mortality of about a quarter, right, for children under 5, which is a massive number, right, and hugely important. And yet there's still a large number of projects that won't even necessarily be thinking about water quality as a key issue. And that's because of the nuts and bolts of the operational delivery and things like how terms of references are set up within a particular department, right? And so the next step that we'll be doing is sort of working with things like these big ticket items that we know are can be transformative, but the different bottlenecks along the way of the bureaucratic organizational structures are such that it becomes very hard just to implement these things within existing systems because of inertia or because of just the fact that there's many other complicated nuts and bolts that have to be worked out. So I'll stop there because I know we want to open up for discussion, but just wanted to give a flavor of some of the ways we're trying to tackle this beast of evidence to policy pipeline within the bank context.
Okay, super. Thank you, Aidan, so much. Thank you to all of you. My internet connection went down, so I missed about maybe 3 minutes, Aidan, of your comments. I just came back in about 1 minute ago. But yeah, we'll just pick up from there. So everyone, please do put your questions in in the Q&A. Before my internet connection went down, I saw 2 additional questions. I don't see them now. So maybe that's because I went down and I came back up. So Austin, if you could put those again in there for me to see, that would be great. I see you've already done one of those. Okay. But first, I'm going to start with Aidan, because I think the question I want to ask you kind of goes to the center of much of what we try to do. And you've done a lot of great work on how policymakers and others update their beliefs based on research, right? And one of your more recent papers finds very large premiums that policymakers put on local evidence. So you talked about the substantial weight that policymakers place on local evidence, and that the kind of the premiums or that they required in terms of anticipated perhaps return on a program recommended from non-local evidence, right, was quite large compared to the anticipated benefits of any program, right? So I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack a bit what you mean by local. Is being local enough? Is it enough to be local for Aidan Colville to come in and collect local data and do analysis and present to the policymakers, right? Or is that not enough for it to be local? So I'm kind of talking about who we work with, how we work. This has echoes of what Bhavani was talking about in the work in India. But could you unpack what you think local really means here?
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. So I'll first answer that question within the context of the paper that you very sort of you summarized really well. But then I think limiting it to the paper results, I think misses a lot of important points. So I sort of expand beyond that a little bit. And so specifically on the paper, we were trying to do is really understand, when policymakers are deciding what evidence to use for what's decision making, what are the different characteristics of this evidence that people find most useful? And as you mentioned, this localization, which probably shouldn't surprise too many people, is a hugely important factor. In that particular piece of work, what we were looking at in localization were two dimensions, right? One is where the evidence was actually generated. So this is the sort of the impact evaluation research evidence. Are you talking about a study that was actually done in Tanzania and you're talking to a Tanzanian government partner, or is it from the region, or is it sort of some international context? And so there clearly the evidence that was available within the local context was far more accepted and sort of used. And I think the point you made, which is a key one here, is the premium that people will put on that is much larger than the impacts of many programs anyway, right? And so it's not so much the question of, is local evidence better than international evidence? Of course, if you've got contextual information and evidence, this is going to be useful. But just the sort of size of the premium, I think, is really important. The second element within this paper, though, is that we also looked at, like, if the type of intervention was recommended by an expert, so not with any evidence per se, but just recommended by a local expert. And so this is where we were trying to get to this question of sort of this idea of codified knowledge and sort of formal impact evaluations versus just what people will use as a sort of and other parts of inputs into the decision-making process. And I think that again, we see very large premiums of if there's sort of recognition and local recognition, regardless of whether there's evidence. Now, this is a very stylized example, right? And so we know that the messiness of the work that we do is not something you can just do in a sort of little discrete choice experiment kind of thing. And so the reality is, on the ground, there's so many different factors. And I want to then bring back this point, which is that, what do we mean by localization and engagement? Some people might take that to say, okay, this means having a local researcher. Some people might say that's having a local, sort of having the work being locally contextual. I think the main thing to be thinking about is coming again to this idea of the organizational, the bureaucratic structure and the organization, that the closer we are to the process of the thinking, which is not just on the information transfer from the formal knowledge, but actually the information engagement in the tacit way. So the equivalent to the discussions within the corridors, which can come from sort of having more local presence. It can come from having more local sort of co-production of the work that we're doing. It can come from having more realistic questions that are aligned with what people are asking for. So there's all of these different dimensions need to be added to thinking about what do we mean by localization. And ultimately it means being as sort of close to the decision-making process as possible, and being as owned and valued within that exchange as well. So that's not just one sort of tick box of a local co-author or a local sort of setting, but really all of these pieces that we should be thinking about. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Aidan. Bhavani, maybe you can pick up on that as well. I'm curious, are you, this research experience that you're having in India, you said it's new to you, right? Are you doing this in a way, or are you already planning to try to publish out of this? My personal comment is that knowing more about the process of how research is done and the process by which we engage with local stakeholders, policymakers, et cetera, we need to understand a lot more about how that matters and in what way to policy outcomes, right? Anyway, if you could comment a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can't say I've actually formally written down any of this. We're 2 years into a 5-year project for the current one, and we're still learning a lot about how local policymaking works and how we can fit into that best. But there's lots and lots of lessons learned, and we are documenting them as we go along. So I hope one day there'll be, a proper thing that we can put on paper and share our experiences with people. Just to say just to pick up from where Aidan left off, but how we've in this project been, what our strategy has been in terms of being capturing that local premium in a sense, which is valued so much, it seems. So what we've done is, first of all, of course, we have local partners, very strong local partners, and goes without saying. So if you're based in an international institution, you're coming from elsewhere, and unless you have absolutely perfect local partners, then it's always a challenge. So the local partner has to, be a co-designer, co-lead, potentially somebody who is, at all steps is with you. We have multiple co-partners in the local area who are helping us with different aspects of it. One thing we've also worked hard on is having part of a team, essentially institutionally based in the institution we're working in for a length of time, so that they are at hand to talk at any time that the policymaker wants to say, look, I'm just thinking about this. What are your thoughts on this? We've got somebody there to advise them. We've got somebody there who is positioned there. And at the same time, when there are things that we want to engage with, we've got a conduit there. So we've actually been trying to do that. And I think it works pretty well. So having personnel embedded within the institution where it's possible, or at least very close by, and having that constant contact is something that's been absolutely critical. The other part of local presence, so we spent a lot of time doing formative work in this research. So before we charged in and had these hypotheses that we of course had a bunch of hypotheses we wanted to test as we started off, but we sort of road tested them in formative work for several months in collaboration with the government agency, facilitated by them, going out and talking to people, doing a lot of qual work, and then drawing those out and bringing them back and discussing them with the policymakers. So before we rushed off, we made sure that we understood the environment really, really well, and that we could talk with confidence with local policymakers about the situation at hand, so that we didn't appear naive, or we didn't appear as if we were coming with some external knowledge that we were trying to impose on the local situation. And we had actually spent some reasonable amount of time studying the local context even before we set out with the main study. Yeah, and we've been trying to create a process whereby we have consistent engagement with a working group from the institution of policymakers. This has been really challenging because they are people right at the coalface of working with communities. They go out and do stuff, and they implement policy, they implement interventions, massively busy. But nevertheless, we've been having a series of workshops with them every, say, 3 months or so, I think last year, where we would try our best to get them into a room for 2 days. Really hard, because they're always being called away to do this or the other. There's a minister that's called up and wants this. They're rushing up. But we tried to get them in a room for 2 hours, for 2 days, where we could talk to them, make presentations, get their thoughts, and then have this ongoing dialogue. And that's been really, really helpful, because over time we've built this trust and built this relationship, and it's been they can see that it's a genuine effort at co-production and co-design with policy. And so those are some of the things that have helped, but it's still, as I mentioned before, it's been really difficult, and it's very time consuming, and not every project can. We've been lucky in having donors who understand the complexity and have allowed us to do that. That doesn't always happen, but it's something worth aiming for. And yes, at some point, would love to document it. There's lots of experiences there. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And so I wanted to pick up again. You say how much time this takes. It's absolutely right. So I want to make a pitch for one of my favorite hobby horses, which is, working with local partners to strengthen their capacity to do this kind of work. Because there's no way that the Bhavani Shankars and the Danielle Resnicks and the Aidan Covilles and the David Shirleys and the Ayala Weinmans and so forth of the world, can be doing all of this, right? The local partners, local research, applied policy research, think tanks, and so on and so forth are the ones that need to be doing it. They're the ones that are doing it, right? And to the extent that we can do our work in a way that helps them plug some of what they see as their capacity gaps a lot better. Okay, a lot of what you all are saying, or at least I want to make some reference to some of the questions that are coming in. We won't get to all of them, but what you both said kind of at least indirectly responds to a question from Brittany Nile about what mindsets are most useful when designing research for policy use. And then I want to turn now to Danielle, because I think what I'm going to ask her also echoes a question from Johnny Musumbu, which is, or a comment that there is a critical point that needs consideration, which is the extent to which policy process takes into account the role of politics and power in shaping the way that knowledge or evidence is produced and used. So Danielle, you and Johan, in your recent Nature Food piece, make the statement that naivete about political economy dynamics will only lead to disillusionment with global and national commitments to transform food systems. So, without meaning to be repetitive with some of what Bhavani and Aidan have said, what particular insights do you think your experience and your research generates for how we need to go about this work and how we can incorporate, how we can not be naive, right? And really make those contributions. Danielle.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, and I see there's a lot of kind of Q&A about the kind of political aspects of policy making. And I think, in terms of the thinking about, what applied development researchers need to be thinking about to not be naive, is often, I think, thinking about why policy recommendations haven't been taken up by policymakers. There's a lot of, I think, great studies where we're kind of repeating the same mantra, invest more in ag R&D, for instance. Subsidies can be wasteful and poorly targeted. There's a lot of advantages to agroecology and so forth. So we see a lot of the same, I think, research coming from different institutions, local and international. And I think when we start seeing this body of work and it's not really translating into a lot of movement on the ground in our partner countries, we need to be a little bit reflective and think about, why not? And is it really just kind of, willful ignorance of some of these policy recommendations, or are there fundamental political economy reasons why governments aren't taking up some of these? Maybe it's some of the bureaucratic issues that I think both Bhavani and Aidan referred to, turnover in the civil service, issues in terms of capacity for implementation. But maybe it really is, going to be losing an electoral constituency if you implement this policy, or it's kind of anathema to the ideology of the party in office. So I think being a little bit reflective in the spaces where we do have a lot of research and we're not seeing it translate into policy, thinking about, do we just kind of repeat the same recommendations, even if it's supported by rigorous research, or do we kind of think about our framing again, how we build some of that trust that Bhavani was mentioning. In terms of how we work as well, I mean, this is where I think interdisciplinary collaboration is fundamental. So, for example, something we're doing at IFPRI is working on a new tool called the Political Economy of Rural Investments, where we collaborate with our economist colleagues who are doing more traditional investment prioritization work. So they're looking at costs and benefits of different investments in value chains or infrastructure or services like ag extension. What are the costs and benefits to poverty reduction, growth, and diets? And then we kind of provide this kind of political economy lens. lens and say, well, looking at these investment priorities from a cost benefit perspective, how might they change when we think about where are these value chains geographically concentrated? Are they in a particular electoral constituency? Are these investments high visibility? Can politicians kind of talk about them on the campaign trail? Can they be subject to different types of distortions in terms of procurement contracts, et cetera? And so sometimes that lens really helps us think about priorities that are not just, impactful for the development outcomes we care about, but also much more politically feasible. So I think in addition to the kind of localization discussion we've just been having, I think that interdisciplinary is really key. And thinking about when there can be some challenges, I think, with the localization. I've worked with some partners in difficult political circumstances who are worried about blowback, from their research, because they are in country and they deal with some of the consequences of some of the research recommendations. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act with the local versus international when you're working with these much more controversial areas with the political economy of policy reform.
Absolutely. Good. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah. So when you think about all the different factors that can influence uptake of policy recommendations, there are all kinds of them. There are some very big ones, and then among those are what evidence is generated and how is that evidence generated, and even that how has many multiple dimensions, right? So it's a complex undertaking, but I'm hopeful that over time we can find ways to do more research about the drivers of impact of policy research, right? Research about the drivers of impact of policy research within this complicated setting. Okay, we have and I apologize in advance that we're not going to get to all of the questions here. Maybe two more. Steve Vosti. Hi, Steve. It's been a very long time since I have seen you. Glad to see your name here. You said that in some cases policy discussion spaces don't exist for issues we need to discuss. How do we go about constructing these spaces? Could I ask each panelist to give a not more than 1 minute, very brief answer to that? How can we go about constructing these spaces? Aidan.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, maybe just one example, which I alluded to a little bit in my previous mention, was what we try to do is think about bringing all these different projects together, which may be thinking individually on their own projects. So you have the government partner, you have in our case the World Bank partner thinking together about their particular project, but they often are just very focused on getting the work through, right, and sort of making it happen. And so what we try to do is have these workshops, depending on the timing, but you'll bring together, like, for instance, last year we brought together 30 different projects across the whole of the Africa East region, right? So all of these projects come together in the same place. Some of them are on water, some of them are on electricity, some of them are on food security, but they're coming together for a week to think about evidence and to think about how to integrate and build that evidence into how they're thinking about their projects. And so
Did we lose? I think we lost Aidan this time.
what we might kind of expect, right? And so this is something where you just sort of create the space. And a lot of people initially will say we don't have time for it, but by the end of the week they say, wow, that was actually really useful because we just don't get that time.
Okay, super. Thank you, Aidan. Bhavani.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's a difficult one, obviously. But I'd like to point to another example of what we're trying to do this. So the space that I work in, agriculture, nutrition, and health, there's something called the ANH Academy, which many people in this audience will be aware of. It's been established and it's been running for a number of years. It's basically a forum that brings together researchers from across the world in the space. The initial phase of ANH Academy's work was really around methodologies, metrics to develop an agriculture, nutrition, health agenda. But as we've gone along now, as we are more mature in this program, the thinking is much more changed towards science policy continuums, getting the evidence that's coming out in agriculture, nutrition, health, which is fantastic now compared to what it was, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were all just drawing these little conceptual diagrams of how ag related to nutrition. It's changed out of sight now. There's massive amounts of really good evidence coming out there now. So now the thinking is really moving towards how can we get it into policy spaces. So it's gradually moving in that direction, and I'm really pleased with that. And I think we need more of those. So it is essentially where every ANH Academy, which has a conference as well, every year or sometimes every 2 years, there is a strong effort when we have it in country. Typically, it alternates between Africa and Asia. There is a strong effort to involve local policymakers, bring them in for 2, 3 days of discussion. And it led to some, for example, last time it was in Malawi, and we had some really top line policymakers from the government, and there was lots and lots of rich discussion there, which was really great. So I think it's moving more and more in the direction. So that's certainly something we need to think more of. Maybe there is something that all our international associations of AgriCon and so on can think about, making this at least partly more of a research to policy space. I don't know how you do it, but I think that might be a desirable thing. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Bhavani. Danielle?
Yeah, I think the same tenor as Aidan and Bhavani. I mean, the importance of different types of convenings. I think, the question can be read in two ways. I mean, there's obviously issues that we need to discuss that may just be that we're not thinking about. I mean, in this space, we're always talking about being demand driven, but there's a lot of value to also being supply driven, thinking about issues on the horizon that policymakers should be taking into account. And I think that creating those types of spaces is probably a bit easier. I mean, you can be thinking about a conference on megatrends, or, whatever the topic is that really should start be getting something on the agenda that policymakers aren't thinking about. But there's a second type of issues which are more challenging, and these are, controversial issues that, there's a lot of polarization around, or more ideological. And I think it's really about maybe finding kind of safe spaces in a way. These may not be kind of international conferences we're talking about. It's maybe kind of, bringing very divergent perspectives, into a room for a few days to talk something through in a way that's not recorded, and no one feels vulnerable, Chatham House rules, et cetera. And of course, as the other panelists have noted, that types of proximity fosters trust and kind of a sense of a kind of repeated relationship to feel more comfortable and engaging in these issues in the future.
Super. Good. All of which adds up to time, reinforcing the need for local organizations to be able to do this, So great. We want to stick to time. We have 1 minute left. I'll simply acknowledge that there are some comments and questions about, monitoring and evaluation, monitoring policy uptake. How much is that done? I think it's not done nearly enough. We need more monitoring and then more studies of that. There are questions about how to build trust, which, I think a number of you have kind of spoken to that, this need for it really starting with the priorities that people in local organizations have, taking them seriously, working iteratively, continuing to engage over time, being willing to compromise, being willing to listen, et cetera, et cetera. So just want to thank everybody for participating. Remind you that the video of this session will be made available on the FSG website. The video of the first one is up already. We'll continue to do that, and please look for coming emails about our activity, our seminars, webinars, discussions in March and April. So thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Bhavani. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Ayala. Ayala Weinman from MSU has really been the driving force behind this. I want to thank her for pushing this and really working to bring it all together. Thank you, Rahwa Austin, and others for your behind-the-scenes work. And we'll see you all again in about a month.